So this is the first in a series of conversations we're having about some of the important and inspirational people buried at Highgate Cemetery, which is one of London's finest cemeteries and is adjacent to where LUX is based, next to Waterlow Park. So today we're discussing the life and work of the pioneering Afro-Caribbean radical intellectual Claudia Jones. I'm really happy to be joined by Dr. Carole Boyce Davies, who's Professor of Africana Studies and English at Cornell University and the author of Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones, and the editor of a reader of Jones's collected writings, Claudia Jones, Beyond Containment, and artist Rhea Storr, whose recent work's been investigating carnival as a space of both celebration and protest, exploring their social structures, costume and language. Rhea is currently undertaking a practice-based PhD at Goldsmiths and is a member of the Not Nowhere Film Collective. So it's obviously a timely conversation as well for many reasons, partly because it's falling the day after Windrush Day, 72nd anniversary of the arrival of the Windrush ship. So I wonder, Carole, would you start by just telling us who Claudia Jones was?
Well, yeah, I need to have this with me, and this is a map, East map of Highgate. And I was quite happy because when the book came out, I sent a copy to the Friends of Highgate. And the second time I went back there, I saw on the map that she's listed. Jones is listed on the map. Yeah. It's a good thing.
Yeah.
So for anybody going, and I send people there all the time. I tell them and they tend to go. Claudia Jones, I think one of the first ways, and I've made notes, so I'll be looking backward. One of the best ways to think of her, people who know Angela Davis today and are totally blown away by Angela Davis's life as an activist, a scholar, and intellectual, think back then to that time period, and Claudia Jones will be exactly that person, or somebody just like her, who would have a similar kind of trajectory in terms of her politics, in terms of joining the Communist Party very young, as Angela Davis did, and then becoming very active and then also writing and articulating the together is the woman, race, and class formation. So Angela Davis has a book titled that, and it's saying my connection is unstable, so I'm hoping you hear me. She has a book titled Woman, Race, and Class, in which she actually cites Claudia Jones in the chapter 10 of that work. But Claudia person, that's one of the first points I want to make, who identified within the Communist Party USA, CPUSA, the whole idea of the triple oppression, the bringing together then of woman, race, and class. Before Angela cites her, but people often just assume that it was coming from Angela Davis, when it was actually coming from a CPUSA position that had been advanced by Claudia Jones. So technically, she is the person who, when you think about those combinations, would be the one that one would have to cite as putting that forward as an intellectual category, but also as a political category, if you understand what I mean. So she's credited by Harry Haywood, and I have this cited really well in my work, for putting on the table of the Communist Party the idea of race as central to discussions that initially Communist parties do focus largely on class or the question of labor. But she would often bring forward not just the race, but the questions of workers' rights, women's rights, and rights of Black people. Then she could use the word Negro, but Black people's rights. So that's Claudia Jones. And then during that period, as you know, there would be a series of attempts to silence Communist Party USA by arresting their leadership. There were 2 waves of arrest of their leadership. The first wave of arrests took in about 70 people, and Claudia was in the second group of people who were arrested. In the first group was a councilman from Harlem called Benjamin Davis, and he was part, along with Claudia and others, of a cadre of Black left intellectuals and activists and politicians who were doing all kinds of interesting work. Now, she identifies herself in all of those ways. So when she gets arrested with that group, She, at that time, was the only Black woman in the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And because of that, she was very prominently identified and supported by a number of Black women's groups across the United States, people writing petitions to have her released and that sort of thing. In the court case, just finishing that first point, when she goes to court and is tried with a group of 13 communists, and there's a nice pamphlet which is called 13 Communists Speak, and her speech is in there. She tells the jury, "You dare not, gentlemen of the prosecution, assert that a woman can think and speak and write." So this is from her speech to the court in 1954. So for me, her identifying herself as a Black woman who thinks, speaks, and writes is a direct claim, in my view, for her claim as a Black intellectual. So a lot of the genesis of my work was to really find, I had spent quite a bit of time working on Black women writers, but I wanted to find the equivalent Black intellectual left woman who would be a counterpart of somebody like C.L.R. James, who everybody knows about. So clearly Claudia meets that standard. The difference is James lives to a very long old age and Claudia dies at 49 years old, just when she was on the verge of, I think, opening up to a whole host of other kinds of connections that she makes around China and Japan and the Soviet Union. So she writes a piece, the piece that she's arrested for is called International Women's Day and the Struggle for Peace. And it's interesting that she gets arrested for giving a speech on International Women's Day. And this is identified in the files as the overt act which the state arrests her for. And in that piece, she says, "These special forms of oppression, particularly affecting the working woman, the farm worker, and the triply oppressed Negro woman, but in varying degrees, they help us to determine the inferior status of women in all classes of society." And this is a point that Angela Davis has used many times in speeches, that Claudia was arguing that the special identification of where Black women sit in society also gives you a good handle of where women, period, are located in society. So that if Black women are able to move politically, then all women will move because of where Black women are positioned in the society. So that's the first part I wanted to say about her as an intellectual subject, as a Black woman activist, as the person who puts on the table the triple oppression of Black women, and that theory then of super exploitation, which I'll come back to later. So who was Claudia Jones? She was born in 1915 in Trinidad and Tobago, where I'm from. So there's nationalistic interest in me pursuing her deeply, which I learned about her from Buzz Johnson, who had just published a small book called I Think of My Mother. And when I met him, he was saying, young women at that time that I was, who were talking about being feminists or Black feminists, that this is somebody you should get to know. And I remember buying the book from him, and I would use bits and pieces of it in my classes. But gradually I was asked to be part of a seminar on Black feminism at the University of Wisconsin. And I thought, because they were also having Deborah McDowell, Bell Hooks, and a number of people, Mary Helen Washington, and a number of people like that, I thought if I'm going to be doing that, then I needed to really go into the Caribbean or break through the linear narrative that is often the one used in African-American circles. And by that, I mean that the idea is to trace logically, as they should, back to people like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, and then bring it forward to the contemporary, right? But it doesn't go outside. It doesn't cross the local borders. So my thing was that anytime I do work of this nature, giving subject position, it would be really important for me to really bring in who the Caribbean women were. And I began to look at that book again and try to do a little bit more research on her, and found that there was really little available. And that's another important point, because she comes to the United States at the age of 8 in 1915 from Trinidad and Tobago, part of that very large first group of Caribbean migrations post-Panama Canal. The family migrates to Harlem in 1924. but she goes to junior high school and elementary school, junior high school in Harlem, and then graduates and joins the Young Communist League in 1936, following what was called the Scottsboro Boys organizing by the Communist Party. The Scottsboro Boys were 9 boys. Whenever I teach this in class, the best comparison is with the Central Park 5, or who are now called the Exonerated 5. These were 9 young boys. The youngest was 12, who were accused of raping 2 white women in a boxcar of a train at a time in history when a lot of youth would go hoboing on those trains looking for work and so on. Of course, it was not true, but the Communist Party USA took this up as a case. The only other organization in the United States, the NAACP, which could have done it, did not have the capacity to do it in that same way, go south and do all that kind of work. So the Communist Party actually goes south. And an interesting aside, the university that I teach in, Cornell University, the law school, has the mock-up of the boxcar, which was used in the defense of the Scottsboro Boys. And when I tell students that, they're quite impressed, that I learned quite happily. And it was donated by the family to Cornell. So before the days when people could use video and all those other things, this lawyer actually had a boxcar made to replicate what the kids were on, and then to identify where the black boys were, where they weren't so. The thing is, the racism there of the state was so vicious in the criminal justice system, which hasn't changed much, as you know, in the contemporary. But basically, they tried those young boys over and over again, and each time maybe 1 or 2 would get away, and then they would try, and then they would try them again. So they were tried repeatedly, but the Communist Party stayed with this case, and they would often be in Harlem talking about it. So it was that kind of political activism on this question of Black people's experience. She found the Communist Party had the best strategies for working through that allowed her to join the Communist Party at age 18. And thereby is the problem that led to her deportation. Because at age 18, she joins the Communist Party. And according to the United States legal statutes following the 1950 cases, the Smith Act and the McCarran-Walter Act, if you were a communist, then technically you were not going to get citizenship. And I need to say that that is still on the form one has to check when you're moving from being a permanent resident to being a naturalized citizen in the US. The last 2 questions are actually the same questions that were asked during the HUAC trials. Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? So she had been, of course. She was in the party, she was central. So she tried and applied for citizenship many times, but never was able to get citizenship. So this is why when she is finally incarcerated and deported, on her passport, she's identified as a British subject. Her Trinidadian identity or nationality then is what bridges her to London, which we'll come back to. But she joins the Young Communist League in 1936. And then in there, this is where she begins to develop her skills as a journalist. She works as an editor for Negro Affairs for Daily Worker. Before that, she worked in a number of other smaller journalistic organs of the Communist Party in different capacities. And I detail all of that in the book Left of Karl Marx, which I'm holding up again. There's a nice chronology there that I worked out. But then she migrates through the ranks and eventually works in the Daily Worker, but on a column in the women's section, which she titled Half the World, which for me, and I've done some other work on that Half the World bit is really critical, because by the time you get to the United Nations Decade for Women, that's the language they would be using. But back then, Claudia's argument was that women represent half the world and therefore should have half of the world's resources. So the column that she wrote in the women's section of the Daily Worker was about half the world. But because of her appointment as secretary of the Women's Commission of the Communist Party, this was one of, which she was elected to in 1948. This is what one of her products was, creating this column and writing about women's experiences. But it was global, it was transnational. She wrote about women in Africa, women in different parts of the world. She was connected to a group, which is a woman international democratic forum, I think. I'm not sure if I'm having it exactly right. But they would give her information on what was going on in terms of women's rights around the world. Because of her activism, she would be arrested 3 times during what is called the McCarthy period, and finally, as we have indicated, for speech that she gave on International Women's Day. She was convicted under that Smith Act and sentenced to a year and a day in Women's Penitentiary in Alderson, West Virginia. That's the same penitentiary that Martha Stewart, the famous Martha Stewart in the US, was sent to. Also, other occupants have included Billie Holiday. Other occupants have included Lolita LeBron. In fact, Claudia was there just after Billie Holiday, or just before, I think. I'm missing the dates in my memory, but in the close proximity, let's say. And there are interesting stories about Billie Holiday refusing to sing. They wanted her to do a show at one point, and she said she couldn't do it because of her union regulations. So Claudia is arrested. She's given a year and a day, and she actually ends up doing 10 months because she's very ill. She repeatedly has problems with her heart. And because of the number of petitions, as I mentioned earlier, of women's groups and a whole host of other community groups, she was released after serving 10 months instead of 1 year and a day that they normally serve. And I'm told by legal people that adding that day, that 1 year and a day, slides the person into a different kind of category of prosecution. That's why they add that sentence, a year and a day. But she served less than that and left in 10 months' time. She tries to really have a stay so that she doesn't leave, because she comes out of prison, I think like October, but several of the appeals did not work. So she was put on actually a cruise liner called the Queen Elizabeth and leased for London on December 9th, after there being a big party for her at the Hotel Theresa in Harlem. And at that, there are all kinds of, if you look at the files, all kinds of memorabilia with people like W.B. Du Bois and Shirley Graham Du Bois sending messages. She was part of that circle of really important Black intellectual and artistic figures, people like Paul Robeson and so on were friends. When she arrives in London, she says, I was deported because I urged prosecution of the lynchers rather than the communists and other democratic Americans who opposed the lynchers and the big warmongers and financiers. This is Claudia Jones, where she talks about being deported due to McCarthyism. So she arrived in England, December 1955, and she's still very ill. She goes into hospital to check on her heart and so on, and is sort of trying to readjust to it, living in a new place. But you mentioned Windrush, so this is critical, 1955. So she's there in very close proximity to that first arrival of Caribbeans in London, and therefore the developing of a Black British, Afro-Caribbean British community, if we want to use that language. Some people don't like it, I know. But after being there a couple of years, she founds the West Indian Gazette and Afro-Asian Caribbean News, which becomes the first Black newspaper in London in 1958. This founding of this newspaper is critical. She gets the support financially from Amy Ashwood Garvey. Amy Ashwood Garvey was the first wife of Marcus Garvey, who also had a residence in London, but also traveled quite significantly to Africa and was found her family in Ghana and that kind of thing, because she went on a search for ancestry before roots. But Amy Ashwood Garvey was one of the supporters and co-founders with her of that West Indian Gazette and Afro-Asian Caribbean News. But she uses, this becomes then a site for her to begin the logic of creating institutions that would support Black communities in London. All of the people I interviewed in doing this work talked about the fact that she was the kind of person that you could go to for help, and she would spend a lot of time trying to make sure you got things that have to do with housing, employment, and all of those things. So she became, in London, according to Donald Hines, a kind of godmother, a kind of person who really looked out for community. This would be continuous, though, we have to say, with what she was doing in the US. So because in the US, she was used to being active and involved, not just in the Communist Party, but also in a series of different types of organizations for Black communities, she continues that pattern. But she is in London, and happily now, because she really, and this is what I mean about that question of being a Caribbean subject, Black British subject on a passport, she is able here now to move away from Communist Party affiliation because of the ways that the CPGB treated her, according to Marika Sherwood, who's done that work. But not only that, that I think in my reading, in my work, I look at the fact that she's more centered in an Afro-Caribbean community that is developing and in need of the kinds of resources that she could bring to them. So she's trained as a journalist, she has activist skills, and from all accounts, people said she moved through London like she was still in Harlem. She would not, according to Donald Hines, she would not take the bus, she would jump in a taxi and go from place to place. She was that kind of person who had a kind of Manhattan, Harlem kind of style and the way she moved. So she founded the West Indian Gazette, which is what it was called first. The Afro-Asian Caribbean News is added later. And this is significant, I want to say, because this adding of this Afro-Asian, excuse me, I need some water, I think. This Afro-Asian Caribbean News to it signals two things. One, she was in a relationship with a guy named Manchanda, who was a Maoist from India, and who, from all accounts, spent quite a bit of time with her. They were always debating political angles and so on. And therefore, she was able to, I think, in the end, be convinced of opening it up beyond West Indian Gazette to look at Afro-Asia, which is a really key term. You still find that term even in a kind of logic of a SOAS. In Brazil, the Center for Estudios Afro-Asiáticos, and the logic of Afro-Asia is really critical, because this, I think, gives us that larger frame, which brings in a larger community. This goes along with another organization she founds called CACO, which is a kind of committee of Caribbean and Afro-Asian organizations. And it is this committee which did a lot of organizing as well around things that were happening in the rest of the world, but also pulling in the Asian community of London. Through the newspaper, she organizes the first London Carnival in 1959 and uses a theme called "A People's Art is a Genesis of Their Freedom," which a lot of artists love that framing, because for them it captures the idea of how art works to liberate people. And of course, there are quite a few documentaries which talk about this. There was a play called A Rock in Water, which goes through this question, because for many of the hardcore Marxists at the time, including Black Marxists, having a carnival or being involved in forming a carnival in this kind of context, they felt was a very frivolous thing. But there was a whole idea of using culture, which many people understand now, as a tool to elaborate communities. But it was linked to the fact that Black communities, Afro-Caribbean communities, were being set upon by white racists. According to Donald Hines, they got letters in the headquarters of the West Indian Gazette from the KKK. And when he told me that, I was like, KKK in England? Yeah, they are white nationalists in England as well, which quite surprised me. Of course, recently I saw them on television coming out to defend the statues and so on. Same thing happening in the United States, in US as well. So she organizes the first carnival, and it's publicized on the BBC. People in the Caribbean could see it. It was organized around the same time as Carnival in Trinidad to give people who were there now sort of cultural kind of outlet. And according to people went through in the subways in costumes and so on. So it was really literally a carnival with all the pieces from beauty queen pageants, dancing, limbo, food, and all the elements that go into making a carnival. I write about this in one of my chapters as well. The point is that it was indoors, but it was indoors because it was February. And according to the interviewees who I talked to, the plan was to move it outside. So the logic of moving it outside when it does happen after she dies is like a natural progression from what was the logic of founding it in the first place. She travels to Japan and the Soviet Union and China between 1962 and 1964. And she goes to China, meets Chairman Mao, and I have photographs of her with Chairman Mao, and interviews Madame Sun Yat-sen, and really is immersed in kind of in global international Black politics in this time, and then comes back to London in August, writes about going to China in one of the poems which are included in the second book, Claudia Jones Beyond Containment. It's called Yan'an, Cradle of the Revolution. And then she gets a sense then of moving away from that Soviet paradigm that she worked with in Communist Party USA to a different kind of Pan-African sensibility, a more global kind of community. If you look at pages of the West Indian Gazette, you will see articles about Ghana. You will see Ghana's independence. You will see articles about Cuba. You will see articles about all sorts of things that have to do with the third world. You would also see articles about what was going on in Black communities in the US, reviews of texts like by James Baldwin, and so on. George Lamming, the writer who I interviewed as well, talked about her work and the fact that she was the kind of person who would always pull him along whenever she was going to a funeral. So she dies going to a rally. I said funeral because that was my next point I was going to make. She dies in December 1964. Her funeral is held in Golders Green and at a crematorium there, and her ashes are interred to the left of Karl Marx monument in Highgate Cemetery in February 1965 with that famous plaque, valiant fighter Claudia Jones, born Trinidad 1915, died in London December 12, 1964, valiant against racism and imperialism, who dedicated her life to the progress of socialism and the liberation of her own Black people. And that plaque is very significant. We are planning, hopefully, to have a bus created in that spot for her, and I can talk about that later towards the end if you'd like. But for me, the placement of her ashes in that spot next to Karl Marx, which is how it was described to me. When I went to see it finally, which was the landmark, of course, was finding the Marx bust, which is easy to find once you go into that part of the cemetery because it's so imposing. But to me, the scale of this large Marx bust and the flat stone, which is identified as where Claudia Jones is, captures the sort of the asymmetry then of their relationship as this powerful figure of Marxism and a Black woman who is really raising all those other questions. But this is precisely where we plan to have a bust erected for her. Not as giant as the Marx bust, but something quite impressive and imposing. Well, so that's the part of it that I like. So Claudia Jones then for me carries all of the dynamism and power that I appreciate in seeing a Black woman. As a Black left feminist myself, she becomes like a central representative of the political positions that today people talk about as intersectionality and so on. I don't see her as representing intersectionality as much as really capturing how Black women are located in various positions that have to do with race, class, and gender. It's a little different, I think, than intersectionality. Okay, so basically then, should I stop or should I just keep going?
That's great. I mean, that's great. I just wanted to kind of find a way to bring Rhea in as well, because
okay, great. So this is a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to obviously to talk a bit more about Carnival, but a bit more about the background out of which that came as well, and this idea of Claudia Jones in terms of constituting this, organising, constituting around the Caribbean community. And I think, unfortunately, this has a real resonance now because, as I'm sure you've heard about this Windrush scandal and the hostile environment in the UK, and about how it's almost like a kind of echo of it's almost like an echo of what was happening in Claudia Jones' time in terms of the Immigration Act, and I'm kind of interested in terms of this question of almost like the political intent around Carnival as well, because I think that has been lost in definitely around the kind of Notting Hill Carnival, that has become this kind of there's been a kind of a depoliticization of it in some ways, and it's become in some ways it has become this multicultural celebration. So in one way it's become depoliticized, but in another way it has become politicized by its relationship to the police and this instability, this idea. And a few years ago they were talking about, they actually used this language of putting a ring of steel around the carnival, and all of this demonization around crime, live crime, and things like this sense of threat, and this echo of so much of the kind of language that was in the neighborhood of West London at the time of the original founding of the carnival. So Rhea, I wonder if you want to say something about your thoughts around the kind of place of carnival in the UK now, in terms of your research and your work.
Yeah, I think that carnival is precisely encourages these kind of tensions because it is the taking up of a space. And in the case of Notting Hill Carnival, it was instigated, I suppose, because of race riots in 1958. So its genesis is the idea that the Black community has a voice, and it has a voice against what was a lot of unrest and racial tension. And I guess you're likening it to now. And at that time there was, people were spray painting "Keep Britain White" and Stop and Search and all of that. So the context of why Claudia Jones produced what eventually came to be Notting Hill Carnival is this moment of unrest and tension between a Black British community and the rest of Britain. In addition to a generation on from Windrush, which were people who are born in Britain, a Black community that was born in Britain. So I think there's kind of like a moment where it's kind of saying enough is enough, and that's why those kind of racial tensions escalated. You see it in 76 when there were also riots, or I guess the preferred term might be uprisings, as Mercer says, because it kind of doesn't demonize the Black community or kind of sway opinion as to how riots might be considered. So Carnival exists in this tense context. But then also thinking about the actual space which Carnival occupies, and going back to 76 and the ensuing riots or uprisings were a direct result of an increased police presence of something like 20 times the amount of police on the previous year. So in some ways that kind of fueled the reaction then from carnival goers, which was kind of started with a few carnival goers reacting to the sort of disproportionate police presence at the carnival. And one sort of way of policing the carnival that had been posited at the time was moving the carnival to Hyde Park. And a lot of people were against that happening because it was a form of control over the carnival, and it was a way for the police to surround the carnival as opposed to the street route, which it still takes now. So there are lots of forms of control which are allied to space and allied to other considerations like sound systems and the physical space that sound systems take, but also sort of the space that sound occupies. within carnival. So, I mean, yeah, carnival is this contested space. In my work, I guess I've sort of examined the ways in which that space has been then reappropriated and reabsorbed into what might be considered cultural mainstream. But I think that's, I suppose, one of the successes of carnival also, in that by opening itself onto the community, carnival also leaves itself vulnerable to be misinterpreted or sort of reappropriated. And I think that's something also that Claudia Jones would kind of be for. You know, Carole, you were talking about the West Indian Gazette and how that was really allied to an international stance, and Claudia Jones thinking a lot about how the local people, the people of Brixton also would want to know about what was happening in the US, in Ghana, for instance. So I think one of the conditions of carnival is that it's open, and it's the kind of way that it's celebrated is quite porous, which you can also see by the way that people pour into the streets. The actual structure of carnival, especially Notting Hill Carnival, in that there's not a delineated space often, or if it is, it soon dissipates, where the spectator is separated from the performer. And that kind of porousness between who's spectating and who's performing, I think, is also really important. It's kind of a democratization of space. So I was really interested to learn that in the beginning, after carnival moved out from St Pancras Hall and other various halls where it travelled, it took this carnival route, but there wasn't a set route in the beginning. So musicians would just travel where they pleased. I think that's also a kind of claiming of a space where there was also thinking about Marxism and issues of class, and big rich-poor divide in that area. It was also a kind of claiming of that space and taking of that space. So there are a lot of ways in which carnival circulates or kind of poses a challenge to power.
For sure. And I would say this is consistent everywhere. There's always that tension between taking space because that's what carnival is. It is taking the streets. And one could look at different forms depending on where one is. So like New Orleans, for example, carnival traffic travels way at once, and different groups, the New Orleans Mardi Gras Indians, they do something totally different in Black communities, and they parade. And the ones in Trinidad have evolved in different ways than was assumed. So I think people make carnival, but there's always that tension between the state, the police are representing the state, and the people, which is built into carnival. So therefore, that's part of the tension is almost automatic. So what they try to do is mitigate. I know years ago, they used to send policemen from England to Trinidad to see how the local policemen in the Caribbean tend to just let people be, and they dance with them and so on. So that now you find them, I hope you still have that, less unwilling to sort of provoke a confrontation, you know what I mean? And instead try to maintain, to go with the flow, as it were. Some of them, even the young women, go and dance on them or whine on them or whatever, which is a whole other thing, different critique. But the tension is there. So everywhere you have the carnival, whether it's Toronto, whether it's Brooklyn, whether it's Trinidad itself, Brazil, and in Brazil, Rio Carnival is like a spectacle, it's like a performance. But Salvador Bahia, where I have been in the carnival, it's more like the Trinidadian one, but it is nighttime. The Black people do theirs at night, which really blew me away. The band started at 6 p.m. So the rest of the day you can go in the beach or do whatever you want to do, but the night is a whole night party. And so it was I love the sense of what it is. So the big bands, we went and waited and sat and And I kept thinking, when are they going to start? And they really didn't start until it was getting dark. So there's the different forms of carnival, and I think the logic of freedom to take space from workers who are every day having to, be constrained, drive to work on those same roads, or take the bus or whatever they do for transportation, or walk to work, still gives them a sense of reclaiming, at least for 1 or 2 days, that space that has been so regimented and limited. So carnival is about freedom. It's about challenging those boundaries that the state have in place. So I think the tension is built in, and you will always have it. Really, I can't imagine. Anytime you don't have it, then there's something that is become very commercial, where the state is making money from it, or it's no longer something that challenges meaning. It's just like, something. I saw the Notting Hill, and people were complaining that, I've been a few times, people were complaining that it's become like a big party. People get drunk. There's just people all over the place doing whatever they want to do. So it's become something else. It's not just the Caribbean version of Carnival. It's more like a popular big street party festival, not so. So I think that, of course, there's the parading part of it, but the rest of it seems like people just do their thing. But just so you know, when I was giving a lecture at Leicester University, one of the universities in Leicester a few years ago, and I was lamenting that when you go to the Marx bust, you see always flowers, roses, all kinds of things always there. And for Claudia, there's usually nothing really. So I was lamenting that about that to the group. And one of the women said, well, why not plant a rose for her? So then next time I went, that same year I went there, I went to the florist, right as you're going up Highgate, there's a floral shop there. I went to the florist and I bought a really pretty gold copper rose. And I took it to the, I had gone to the cemetery already. I took it back now to try to find somebody to plant it. And when I went back, the cemetery was closed. But there was a young man there who was one of the workers. And I told him what it was. And I said, this is a rose I bought for Claudia Jones. She's the woman who created the carnival, which became Notting Hill Carnival. And he said, well, then she deserves this to be planted. And he took it from me through the fence. So if you ever go there and there's that gold copper rose, it's linked to carnival, because he said if she created that, then she needs this to be planted there. He took it, and I was so pleased that somebody sent me a photograph at one time of the year when the flowers were in bloom and they were all there.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Carole, I know that you don't have much time, so one last point. So I just sent an article to you yesterday about, obviously there are many discussions about statues at the moment in the US and here in the UK, and there was an article kind of advocating for a statue for Claudia Jones, which sounds like a brilliant idea, because we have 2 statues of Black British women in the UK, Mary Seacole and Kelly Holmes, who's an athlete. And, this seems, I wonder if you just want to say something about like an argument for a statue for.
Absolutely. I was so happy to see that. And I posted it on my Facebook right away and on my Twitter feed. So thank you for that. Absolutely deserving of a statue. My goodness. That's why we were trying to think of doing something at Highgate, and we'll still do that. But I think there should be something in a public space that celebrates her. I mean, she's gotten the stamp and quite a bit of now around the world for who she is. So that's no longer debatable about who she is in terms of her contributions, both to the United States and definitely to England. So I would say yes to some sort of a statue in her honor that captures her in a really interesting, dynamic way that she presented all the time. So I'm hoping that happens.
Yeah.
But we will do eventually, we still want to do something, because one of our colleagues said one day to me, why do you always lament the fact that there's only that flat marker, and why don't you create something there? So we have to do it, but we need to create a bank account for it properly so that the money is separated. And a lot of people wanted to donate to it. So once that happens, and everything is set for how to do that and where and so on, I will definitely share it with you so that you can let people know. I'd be happy to do that. So there should be 2 statues. One in Highgate to really set up nicely next to Marx or left of Marx, and something maybe in Notting Hill or somewhere like that where, you know.
Absolutely.
She can be represented and people can. I was quite impressed. I have to say this, because I went to Bristol one time when I was in England just to see, and I went to the museum and I discovered that there were like 1,200 slave ship journeys that left from Bristol. And it's in the museum and documented, and some of the names are still there. So I was quite amazed when I saw the youth had taken down Colson, and I could not believe it. So I'm still complimenting this generation, including you, Rhea, for sort of doing the finishing. I said this generation are the finishers. You're finishing all the things the decolonizing generation didn't get to do, or were trying to protect themselves. Because I keep saying that the state has been very violent to Black activism over the years, as you can tell. We actually lost people who were assassinated, whether it's the conservative Martin Luther King Jr. or the more radical Malcolm X, both got killed, and several others. And most of the Black leaders are still in prison, 48 years leaders, political prisoners. Many of them are becoming old men. Assata Shakur is in exile in Cuba. So you have this. The one that we have before that maintained connection up to the present takes me back to where we started, Angela Davis. And I'm so pleased that she's able to witness, and she is so touched by the kind of activism. She said it's nothing that she would have imagined would have unfolded as it has in this contemporary period. So that's my joy as well.
I think it's important as well to, I don't think we've fully resolved what happens beyond the taking down of such statues, like thinking about Cecil Rhodes' statue in Oxford, which will come down now. It's the first step in thinking about how to decolonize, to use a very overused phrase, decolonize the curriculum. So, yeah, I think it's just sort of the first step, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a whole project, isn't it? Yeah, but these are all symbolic that have to happen, and the work has to take place. Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both so much.
Yeah, what a joy. Thank you. I'm so happy to meet you. And I look forward to
it's really great. And thank you so much.
I love talking about Claudia Jones. And as you know, I have so many more notes that we didn't get to.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Carole. Well,
I'd love to do it again.
And hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation.
Absolutely. Let's keep in touch, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so
much.
I
love, anytime I'm invited to talk about her, I always say yes. So
fantastic.
That's the one thing I'll respond to positively all the time.
Okay, brilliant.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Be well.
Bye.